My name is Brent Loken. I'm with EAT. EAT and Asset Commission, I was one of the lead authors, worked on that for almost 3 years, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And as we think about the turning the knowledge into action, and thinking about these commitments, I think each one of us are wrestling with the urgency of the crisis, but the realities of what it means to actually implement that within our cities and within our business. And there's a bit of a tension there that will be good to tease out during what we talk about. Now, many of us were in New York City 2 weeks ago, and it was an emotional time for a lot of us, I think. We were hoping that governments were going to come up and step up with some firm actual on the ground commitments. But unfortunately, the large countries didn't do that. This is where cities and businesses can step in and they can fill that gap and they can raise the global ambition towards this. So it's an honor to have all of you here and to learn about some of the work that you are doing. So, first off, I would like to introduce Niels Lund. He's going to do a 6-minute keynote for us to talk about some of the work at Novo Nordisk that they're working on. And what's so important about the work that they're doing is they're working specifically with cities. And it highlights this interaction that businesses and cities have to play in order to move this forward. So I welcome you to the stage, Niels.
Thank you. Oh, that sounds very loud. How appropriate to have a session about food just before lunch. You can think about food for the next 60 minutes and then you can go out and grab your lunch. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and give a fly-in over what we've been doing. I'm here representing Cities Changing Diabetes, a global partnership between the Steno Diabetes Center and University College London. And 22 cities around the world trying to prevent obesity and diabetes. For the last 4 years, we've collaborated closely with C40 about mapping the mutual benefits of climate investments and health investments and see where they overlap. And recently, we're partnering with EAT to kind of build that triangle between climate, health, and food. And this is kind of, I'll end with food, but I think let's just have a quick fly-in. But let me just put one thought in your head. We know CO2 is the early indicator of climate change. My postulate would be that obesity is to health what CO2 is to climate. And maybe that's the leading indicator that we need to look at if we want to have healthy societies. But when we look at from our work with the C40, we have learned that climate and health do share many of the same root causes, but therefore there are also many solutions that are similar. Where if you apply certain solutions, then they will have an impact both in the climate field but also in the health field. Let's just look at diabetes. So. Just almost 20 years ago, diabetes prevalence was 4.6%, and it's doubled in the last 2 decades. Maybe it's not something you recognized, and actually, when you look at it, it's predominantly because the growth in diabetes has happened in low and middle income countries. It's also a flip side of a good story. It's the flip side of economic growth and prosperity. It's, when we expand our economies, we also expand around the waist. And that is leading to that growth. But the problem is if that growth continues, we will see some of the same effects on our economies as we're seeing of climate change. 50% of the population today live in cities, or 52, but 2/3 of the people with diabetes live in cities. And that overrepresentation will continue to grow even as urbanization grows. So with diabetes, there are things you cannot change. Age, geneticity, ethnicity. I mean, those are factors that don't impact, do impact diabetes, but we can't and shouldn't do anything about it. Certainly not aging, but there are factors that do influence the risk of diabetes: obesity, nutrition, and setting. And I hope then you can see how this triangle of climate, health, and food belong together. And 44% of the risk associated with diabetes is obesity. So when I put the two curves next to each other, but so this is kind of the familiar thing. That's what we've talked about the last 2 days, bending the curve on the climate. But there's a similar curve to bend on diabetes. Why don't we do concerted action to bend both curves? I think it's possible if we plan smart in cities. The big challenge is that we need to bend the curve on diabetes. We need to to reduce obesity by 25%. If you have ever been on a diet, you know how difficult that is. And doing it on a societal level, just imagine what that would do. And if we don't do it, it will cripple our economies. It will ruin our productivity, and it would, maybe it will not have as bad effects as the climate change, but who wants to be first and second in that hierarchy? So in the work that we are doing with cities changing diabetes, the nexus of this is prevention, both of obesity and diabetes, and those are the same things when we look at it. But behavioral change in this context is really, really important, and understanding those social and cultural determinants that drive poor health is really, really important, because if we don't understand them, then we don't devise solutions that will be effective and be inclusive. And what we see when it comes to obesity and diabetes and the risk, it's mistrust, social isolation, and time poverty. The fact that you commute maybe 2 hours every day in Houston to and from work, and then you don't have time to get a healthy meal or exercise or do some activities with your children. So understanding those cultural dimensions and social factors are really, really important. And then we get to food. It is like an iceberg. And as somebody said earlier today, maybe an iceberg is not the most appropriate image for this setting, but nonetheless, food is biological, and I appreciate all we do to make sure that we get the right nutrition. But food is also social. When you ask around the world, people say when we meet, we eat. Everywhere. I haven't found a place where food is not a social fabric, and so there is a component we need to understand, and that food is also culture. I eat food that reminds me of my childhood. I mean, I do that. There are things that I'll continue to eat for the rest of my life, that bring me back to my childhood. So food is habits, it's feelings, it's beliefs, it's memories. And I think if we appreciate and understand the complexities of human behavior in this field, then we have a chance to change and improve nutrition, improve health, and the climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. That last slide of yours is so important because it touches on the various aspects of food, and it emphasizes why food is so tricky. It's so tricky to change what we eat, but it also gives us an opportunity because of all of those things that you mentioned. So what do we know? We know that number one, health is getting worse, like Niels said. We know that biodiversity is being lost globally at rates like we've never seen before. We know that climate is changing faster. Well, it's actually changing as fast as the fastest climate model said it would. That's what we know. But what we don't know as much about is the role that food plays in this. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about environmental crisis, we tend to talk about there's energy, there's transport, electricity, there's buildings, there's all those carbon dioxide emissions. And we know that that's a really important part of the problem. But what we don't talk about as much is the role of food and land use. And that's 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's from the food that we consume, and it's the land that we use. If you've been watching the news about what's happening in Indonesia and Brazil and what's happening with the rainforest, that really highlights the fact that the way that we're using land and the food that we're eating is contributing to climate change. And if we don't solve food, and if we don't raise it to the level that it should be within the international discourse, we won't be able to actually meet Paris. Now, this is one of the main goals and reasons that we did the Eat Lancet Commission, is we wanted to raise the profile of food within this international discourse. The main goal was, can we feed 10 billion people a healthy and also sustainable diet? We know that we can feed people calories, but can we actually feed every single person a healthy diet? And that was a question that we were actually trying to solve. But first of all, we had to actually define what a healthy diet was. And there's still confusion about that. If I was to ask you guys what a healthy diet was, I'd probably get very different views on this. When you read the literature on this, it seems very confusing, and national dietary guidelines are all over the place. So what is a healthy food? We wanted to bring an international consensus to what that was. Second is, what is a sustainable diet? Also confusion on that. Is it only about greenhouse gas emissions or water, genetically modified, local versus non-local, organic? I mean, all of these we wanted to bring some sort of clarity to. So we set these two different targets, healthy food, sustainable food, and we said, well, can we actually do both? Is it possible to feed every single person on this planet, and by 2050, 10 billion of us, healthy food within the limits that the Earth has on us? Good news, it's possible. We can actually do it, but barely. And the three actions that are needed to do this. First is we need a global shift towards healthy diets. That's one of the number one levers that we can take. Second is we have to reduce food loss and waste. And reducing food loss and waste is absolutely a key part of the puzzle. Third thing is we need to change how we actually produce food. Now, the great thing is reducing food loss and waste and diets are addressed within the Good Food Cities Declaration. And that particular declaration is based on the best and latest science out there. So now what? It's urgent. We need all hands on deck. And we're not going to wait for others to lead, so that's where businesses and cities can actually step up to lead. And it's my honor to introduce and have these city representatives come here to talk about the individual actions that they are taking, and maybe even some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of how do we actually implement this. So I'm honored to have you guys come up, and if you'd come up and share the stage with us. So, the AllStar Panel, we have Mayor Sisse Marie Wellings from the City of Copenhagen, Mayor of Health and Care. Mayor Franciska Rosenkilde, is that right? Yeah. Mayor of Culture and Leisure. And the great thing about having two representatives from the City of Copenhagen is it shows that we can't work in silos, that this can't be one particular department's problem, that we have to work together. So it's great to have you both up here. From the city of Stockholm, where I'm from, we have got Katarina Luhr, the Vice Mayor of the Environment. And we have Minister Pauline Kahiga, the County Minister for Food and Agriculture from Nairobi. It's an honor to have all you guys here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, first question, Mayor Rosenkilde. So, Copenhagen just launched a new food strategy. I believe it was a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty ambitious. Mm-hmm. It's very bold. And I'd like you to share a little bit about the strategy, what is in it, and what it entails, focusing on climate and how you're going to address food related to climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for having this debate. I'm very thrilled that the whole food issue, both the production and the consumption now, is a part of the climate debate, because it has been more about transport and energy. But as we just heard several you guys saying, that it is a very food is a huge part of climate change, and how we produce and how we consume. So I'm very glad that we now can discuss food not only as a cultural and an emotional thing, but also as part of the climate crisis. But as you just said, last month we passed a new food strategy in the City Council of Copenhagen, which really was to take the whole climate and sustainable food within the very ambitious and healthy food that we have in Copenhagen, where we have been working on having 90% of all the public meals organic. So this was kind of the next step on integrating now climate and the sustainable part into the diet. We serve around 70,000 meals a day, and which is kind of a huge driver also for the food production in Denmark on what kind of meals do we want to give our citizens in Copenhagen. So we don't, I mean, one of the goals is that we want to reduce the CO2 emissions by 25% in the 2025. And we don't actually know 100% how to get there. But I think that is one of the thing about being a politician is that you have to be ambitious and you have to have visions, and then you will set these goals, and then you will find out how to solve it along the way. But what we know is, of course, that cutting down on the meat, on the red meat especially, and also the food waste are the two main things that we need to look into. But I think also this is very important because in Denmark and in Copenhagen, we are very green. But if you look at our consumption, we are not that green. We have a very high CO2 print. And also, it as was said earlier, that when you are in the rich part of the world, you consume a lot.
Yeah.
And we have to talk about consumption. So this is also about, of course, what do we as a city want to provide our citizens, but it's also about inspiring Copenhagers to change their diet on everyday basis and say, okay, if when I go to work and my kids in daycare, if they get the inspiring more plant-based meals, then I want to change as well. So it's also about talking about consumption.
Absolutely, and you raised a couple really good points. I mean, first off is let's set targets, but we don't know how to get there. But at least let's set the targets. And I think anybody that says we know exactly how to get there is lying, because we don't, especially when it comes to food. This is a fairly new issue that we're starting to tackle. So I think it's a very bold move that you have set that 25 greenhouse gas emissions at least as that target. We can work out the details now later together. And also the fact that you're one of the few cities and places that integrates the environment and health components into these strategies, and they can't be siloed any longer. We have to start to integrate those.
And I'm very much agreeing with Novo Nordisk on that you could actually see climate change as the new kind of lifestyle disease on the global scale. So it is something about when we have the unbalance between land use and how we produce and how much we're damaging the climate and the environment, then we also are unbalanced, getting sick, getting obese and diabetes. And we have to look at it much more holistic if we want to save this planet and the climate.
Absolutely. That was a really good framing of that. All right, Katarina, Stockholm. The Good Food Cities Declaration, you signed up for it. Now tell us how you're going to implement it. Solve that question, or answer that for all of us, please.
Yeah, no, but it's really great that we have this declaration. I think it's important to have a target now that is based on science, and we have a long-term goal to reach. Actually, in Stockholm, we started working on the food issue a couple of years ago in an attempt really to look at the consumption's emissions, since we don't take those in account from the beginning. So we started making this recipe book called the Smart Kitchen, with the numbers of how much emissions different kinds of food gives out. And this book was given out to the Stockholmers to learn how to cook more climate smart. And we had the goal in this book that you could actually reduce your footprint in half from your emissions by just cooking more climate smart without even becoming a vegetarian or a vegan, even if you could reduce your footprint even more becoming a vegetarian or a vegan. So that was really good, and it was also upsetting since the cultural issue that you shouldn't mix your political visions in people's food. We also started working in schools to teach kids about the importance of climate change in food. And then we started working on food waste. And I don't think that's a very controversial question anywhere, since you don't want to throw away good food. And people learn that from their kids, really. So we had competitions in schools. If if the kids could reduce their food waste for 2 weeks, they could get the dessert the last week and things like that. So we actually did a lot of good things about that. Then there were actually some preschool chefs that took lead in trying to reduce their impact in the food that they were making. So we still have a really good cluster of chefs in Stockholm that are really interested in reducing the footprint. So they were making like Swedish meatballs with a lot of vegetables instead of meat, so they could cut the meat in the meatballs with about the half without the kids even noticing it. And they have been working really hard on that. But we didn't have a food strategy. So in May this year, we took a new food strategy for Stockholm, which is focusing on health and on climate impact. And this food strategy has a couple of scopes that I think are really important. And one of them is that we should always try to serve 2 meals in schools and for the elderly, and one should be, or at least one should be vegetarian. Because now the vegetarians are usually get like heated up food that is not as good as the other food that is served. So it's an alternative instead of showing kids that you can choose between 2 different meals. And we also, one thing that I think is really important is to try to have like a, you were talking earlier, or someone was talking about the lack of time. And I think most kids in school have very short time to eat, so they take too much food. So if they could have like a more pleasant lunch with a little bit longer time, they could actually take a little bit less the first time, and they could go back and take more if they want to. So that is one way of reducing the food waste also. So we have a lot of different like scopes, but I think some keys are really education of the chefs within Stockholm. And also the procurement, of course, that we should know and also calculate the impact of the food that we buy. So education both for the procurement team and also the chefs that are making the food.
And you raise up an extremely important point about how to actually cook vegetarian food, because I think a lot of us, one of the biggest hurdles is when we go into the supermarket, we don't know what to buy. We don't know how to cook these beautiful vegetarian dishes, and it's one thing to get them served to us, it's another thing to come home and do it within your homes, and then to expect chefs to be able to automatically shift. So there needs to be some sort of training where we bring everybody on board, and then people can see, oh, it's actually not that hard.
Yeah, I think
We
that's
can do
really
this.
important. And we are now also looking at some kind of tool, because if we buy food, we can probably get a tool that shows the impact or the climate impact of the food. But we would also like to see like an information for the school chefs that they make an impact when they plan the meals. So we need a tool that both shows the procurement people and the school chefs what kind of impact they make by doing different dishes.
Yep.
Yep.
Exciting. Minister Kahiga, so you've been developing a new integrated food system strategy, which sounds extremely exciting. Could you tell us a bit more about this integrated strategy and how you see in the future it lines up with the Good Food Cities Declaration?
So thank you. Nairobi is the capital city of Kenya, which is in East Africa, a very popular city. And historically, our position has been that it's been predominantly a food importing city. We don't grow the food in Nairobi. And a lot of Kenyans who produce food have relied on traditional climate and weather to grow food, which has not been very consistent. But this unit, we set up a unit in my ministry called Food Systems. And the reason that we did this, and are currently in the process of coming up by extension with a robust food strategy system, is because we realize that as climate changes, Nairobi is suffering because we no longer get the food from the other rural cities like we would before, and whatever comes is not in the right quantities. We don't know how it's been grown, so we've relied heavily on bringing food from other cities. Now, I'll have you know that the population of Nairobi as a city is 7 million people, which is about 15% of the national population. Of these 7 million people, 50 to 60% live in informal settlements, what we call the slums, where income is a problem. So even if you bring food into Nairobi city, they don't have the capacity or ability to be able to buy food. most of the 50 to 60% of this population that lives in the informal settlements live on one meal a day. And even in that meal or that food basket, whatever constitutes that food basket, we would not even discuss it in terms of nutrition. It's just a meal, food on the table. So bearing that in mind, we needed a food system strategy that's going to address the food insecurity in Nairobi, because we have no assurance of there being food on the table. So that is what the food strategy that we are coming up with as a sector is about. And it's been exciting because it has involved us going to the ground, interviewing. Actually, when I say the ground, I mean the informal settlements. So we go household to household, trying to ascertain how many people have a food basket a day or can afford a food basket a day. And we have 4 situations. We have the normal situation where 3 food baskets a day, meaning you can afford 3 meals in a day based on how many people in that household are earning an income. So we really do have a problem. And the markets as well, the places where the food is then sold, was another place we went and engaged at ground level to ascertain the level of how deep this problem is. And so this food system strategy at the moment, at national level, we have legislation that is in place. But at county government level, because we devolved, food and agriculture is now a devolved function in the counties within Kenya, all 47 of them. And it's a question of customizing that national legislation to your county based on the uniqueness of the needs and the security issue, the food security issue in that county. So at the moment, this strategy is supposed to then set the legislative framework, which will be passed at the county assembly level. And then that is what will guide what the priorities will be for Nairobi as a city.
So you're seeing that that food and food systems are being elevated within your levels and within the
That's right.
national level discourse.
Yes, that's right. At national level, there was already legislation that was in place, but customizing this based on the needs of each individual county is what now we're doing. And you have to take it and adopt it to your county. So Nairobi is just one of the counties, although it's the capital city. We have 46 others, so we have in total 47 counties. So that's what we're doing. We have engaged at the ground level. We have put together the draft strategy paper, which shall be tabled at the county assembly for review. They will then do a public participation as well, go back to the ground just to ensure that what the county government executive side is proposing resonates with what the Kenyan or normal average Nairobian needs are in terms of food.
And what's so important about this discussion and is that I think when we think of climate change, we know that it's this global issue that we have to solve globally. But when we think of food systems, we tend to think more on like the citywide or the national level. And we need to also start thinking that food systems is also a global problem. Yes. That we're ensuring healthy diets for every single person on this planet, and it's a global equity issue. And that we need to start taking that seriously and start having these discourses about what does it mean for all of us to work together to make this happen.
True.
Yep.
I think very much also is about that the whole food industry have been very much led by economic interests and has never been really focusing on health. So there's a change in how we view on health and food production. It's not only about keeping the environment safe now and the drinking water and the earth that we use with the nutritions. It's also about that health is not about a heavy meat diet with a lot of sugar and junk food and all of this that has been very much the driver for the whole food industry until now. Yep. So it's also a change in the way we are thinking economically in our society.
Absolutely. So, Mayor Wellings, the food environment is so important in terms of making food accessible and affordable to everybody. And this is one of the issues that you just brought up in terms of some individuals within cities don't have enough to eat. There's not accessible. Or there's even like the idea that healthy food is so expensive that we actually can't. So what are you doing as a mayor? What influence can mayors have in terms of being able to influence the local food environment?
I think that cities play a huge role in this important dietary shift that we have to make in all our cities around the world if we want to reduce our carbon footprint. And I'm very proud that we have made this strategy in Copenhagen. It wasn't easy all along the way, but I'm very pleased that health plays such a prominent role. And the reason for that is that healthy food and sustainable food go hand in hand with each other and complement each other very well. I think that cities play a very important role because we buy groceries, and is a big player on the market when we buy groceries. We serve, as Franciska told you, 70,000 meals every day in our public kitchens, and if these meals are greener and healthier, it will have a substantial impact on the city's carbon footprint and on the citizens' health as well, because we see urban diabetes growing in the city, and we see that urban diabetes is the fastest growing chronic disease in a city like Copenhagen, and it's the most deprived areas where we see the biggest rises in the number of people getting the disease. And secondly, it makes a difference by our procurement practices. Serving greener and healthier meals in all our city kitchen will affect producers. And it would be more attractive for farmers to shift their production to greener production in the farming industry. And we've done it before. More than 10 years ago, we set a goal that 90% of our food should be organic. At the time, we couldn't buy 90% when we went out to grocery stores, and we had to shift the entire industry in Denmark. And what we saw were that were a rise in the organic farmers in Denmark. We also saw that we had to cut meat in our kitchens because organic meat is very expensive, and we didn't have more money for buying food in the kitchens. We had to educate our chefs in the kitchens, so we have been doing that, making sure that you were serving much more seasonal based products in the kitchen. It's cheaper. You don't have to import the vegetables. We live in a country where we don't always have fresh vegetables all year round, so that was important as well. So I think that it's very important that we talk about that. And the last thing is that it's very important that we look at food culture, because it's not easy for the deprived part of our citizens to make this change. We know that the well-educated, they are already there. They are shifting their food habits right now. They are eating organic. They are eating less meat, more fish, and so on. But we know that if you have other problems in your life, you will have. It will be very much harder for you to make this shift. And for me, as Mayor of Health and Care, it's very important that we don't increase the inequality in health with this huge shift that we have to do as cities, but we lessen the inequality in health instead.
Absolutely.
But it's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And you raise up a very important point in terms of if you put the appropriate policies in place, it can also shift and have influence on what farmers actually produce. And there is that interaction between both ends that we need to absolutely consider.
It's a very important point also, because in Denmark we are like 5 million people and 25 million pigs.
Yeah.
So if we if we turn into a more greener diet, as you said about the organic situation, we actually are driving the Danish production to change.
Yep.
And as you said before, that the whole production of food is a global issue. So maybe Denmark have 25 million pigs, but they are importing the fodder from southern America, on Brazil and Argentina, where all the soy proteins are the main cause of deforestation. So it is so important that we see this food system as a global issue every time. And I totally agree with you on the cultural and the health issues around it, and we have to take that into consideration, but also never compromise on the ambition on climate change.
Absolutely. Okay, Katarina, you have committed to cutting food loss and waste by 50% in Stockholm. Food loss and waste is one of those issues that I think we should all take extremely seriously, because I think it's absolutely crazy that we waste 1/3 of the food that we actually produce, where some people don't have enough food to eat, but yet we're throwing stuff in the garbage. What are some actions? How do you plan to do this?
Yeah, it's not easy. We have 2 strategies. I mean, the first one is, of course, to really reduce the amount of food that is thrown away. I gave you some examples on how we have been working in schools, like really trying to encourage the kids not to throw away food, also making the lunches nicer so they can actually have the time to take the amount of food that they want and then take more if they need to, instead of taking a full plate and then not having the time to eat it up. Then I think it's really important also that we serve good food that people like. And I know that there are some projects in other parts of Sweden when they have actually looked at what days do we have the most food waste, and what kind of food do we serve at those points. Do we really need to serve like really heavy things at hospitals when people wake up from operations, for example, and if they don't serve that, of course they will not throw away as much. So we have to have that strategy. Then with the food that we throw away, because we know that we will have waste from the food, and for us it's really important that we take that food waste and make biogas and biofertilizer. And in Stockholm right now we collect around 30% of all the food that is thrown away that goes to biogas and biofertilizer, but we need to increase this number. We have a goal of collecting at least 70% of all the food that is thrown away. And we also use the biogas. All the waste trucks, for example, runs on biogas. 25% of the buses runs on biogas. So we need the biogas that is produced from the waste also. So I think these 2 strategies, first to really try to cut all the food that is wasted right now that you can still eat, and then to try to use it the rest of the things. I also run a collaboration with the companies in Stockholm called the Climate Pact. And in that pact we have at least 5 or 10 different companies that work on food waste. For example, we have one company that works on buying food that has very short expiration date, and then they sell it on the internet really cheap. And they came to present their work at the Climate Pact meeting, and they said that they were so proud because in 1 year they had gone from like 4 guys working nights till 50 collaborators, and then they had been sitting down in the morning calculating that no, we're actually 86 people now working in this company. So it's like a huge business in trying to really take care of the food instead of throwing it away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, there's I think changing adults can be quite hard sometimes, but as you focus, if you change the kids' behavior, they'll go home and tell their parents, and that's when parents will actually change. When the kids tell them to change, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea, and it really works.
It is a fantastic, and the business opportunity, there's some interesting things happening within the food loss and waste. I mean, some interesting apps that you can download that you can actually go up and pick up old food or food that might be thrown away at like a restaurant or some other place, and so there is actually technology which is actually coming in, and that whole space seems to be exploding right now.
Yeah, and I think people get to know that much better because it haven't been like that in a long time. But I know that there are also food stores in Stockholm that for the last hour on the day, they sell the remaining food for students for like 1/10 of the price, so they can go and buy food there. And I think there are so many different examples on what you can actually do if you have a store instead of throwing away the food to make it more accessible to people with maybe less money or.
Yeah, and it's also as we think about food loss and waste, it's also we tend to think about the waste that we put into the garbage, but also if we're eating too many calories than we need, that's also waste. That the waste of calories that could actually go somewhere else. So it's also thinking about food loss and waste in a very holistic way, I think, as well. Minister Kahiga, in Nairobi, you're facing the difficult challenge of the double burden. Some individuals don't have enough to eat, some have too much to eat, or are eating too much, or eating too much of the wrong things, or don't even have access to the right foods. How are you going to tackle this tricky problem moving forward?
Yes, I had said earlier that Nairobi is at a very interesting stage. We're at the stage where we're setting policies or guidelines that shape where Nairobi goes in as far as food and food security is concerned. So it's a very exciting time for us in Nairobi, a discovery mission. So at the moment, our biggest challenges have been on, besides the strategy and setting up a strategy that serves as a guideline, is on making sure that we have enough financial and technical resources that are going to drive this vision or this agenda forward. So that, in a sense, has been a bit of a challenge, and we have engaged a lot with, as I said, at grassroots level, but also with private partnerships to come in and step in and try and see how we can have a balance between the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots are fewer. I gave you the percentages of what Nairobi's population is like, and majority of them live in the informal sector. But even those that have, it's a balance of, as the panelists have said, having the right diet, even for those that have, because just because I can afford 3 or 4 meals a day, but what is a nutrient, or what is the constitution of the meals that are being put on the table for those in Nairobi, that the awareness is not there in terms of the level of engagement that you have in your countries. In Nairobi, it is just about because it's available and I can afford it. But we have the advantage of having fresh food. It comes daily in truckloads to Nairobi from the rural areas. So the food is fresh. So that's maybe what has served as a plus for us. We don't eat a lot of the refrigerated or very processed foods in Nairobi. So that, by God's grace, has been our saving grace. That's why you won't have too many cases of obesity in Nairobi. But the food insecurity issue is where the biggest problem is. And our challenge is on what can we do in terms of technical resources or the know-how in balancing out between what comes and how we can store it or keep it for a day that we need it. As I said, there are 4 situations. When we did our assessment, we have the normal stage where people, it's normal, there is food available. But there is a stage we call the alert stage. So what do we do when at the normal stage we have available resources, we have available food, say milk, nutrients? I mean, what are we doing about converting that to a state that it can be used at a later stage? For example, Nairobi does not have the plants, too many of them, maybe 1 or 2, that can convert the fresh milk into powdered milk, which can then be kept or stored for a time when we're at alarm or response stage where we need to actually take it to the people when they require it. So little things like those, having what we call the stockpiling, so that we can have the supplements, the food nutrients, the supplements, the milk, the vegetables, dried fruit and things like that, to be able to distribute them when it's required during the critical stages of alert and alarm and response stages, especially in the informal settlements. Malnutrition is also very high amongst the children, because what we started as Nairobi County was a milk a milk distribution process. So to get all school going children, early stages, maybe between the ages of 3 to 6 years old, whenever they go to school, there is free milk distributed at the schools. So for us, this had to work through joint partnerships with the private sector, the producers or the packagers of this milk, so that they could at least have certain packages or supplements that are given to the children right from that level, because malnutrition is very high amongst the young children in Nairobi, below 5 years of age. And this translates or sets the pace as you move forward, as they become adults. So already that issue is down there. So our equation is a bit different. It's not about the obesity. It's about malnutrition. It's not about having too much. It's about ensuring there is enough, just as a basic. So that's, we would be looking forward to having a lot of benchmarking sessions with other cities. We invite them to come to Nairobi. There's lots of opportunities for people to see how they can partner with the county government of Nairobi, the country as a whole, because this problem is not unique to Nairobi only. And it's a question of what technical and financial resources can we engage in to put Nairobi to where we want it to be and to realize the visions and strategies we have for Nairobi.
Absolutely, and you brought up some extremely important points in terms of, as we sign cities up onto this declaration, it's one thing to solve the problem in Copenhagen and Stockholm, and another thing to solve it in cities like Nairobi of 7 million people facing both extremes, and we need to figure out how we scale this globally and tackle with the issues which are extremely different in different places. I mean, it's hard enough to do it in Copenhagen and Stockholm. I look forward to hearing more about some of these benchmarking systems that you have. I mean, even like setting baselines and benchmarks for cities is something that we're working with quite a bit. So I look forward to hearing more. I'd like to open it up to the audience now. We've got about 8 minutes for questions. Unfortunately, not as much as I'd like, but Stefania, you want to help with the mic? And let's go right here to this gentleman in the, or right here, okay. And then to this gentleman in the middle.
It doesn't work. Now it works, yes. And I'm working for Oatly, who make oat-based drinks, and I'm also chair of a Swedish industry organization called Plant-Based Sweden. And one thing which I come back to Novo Nordisk's excellent presentation about children, also what you're talking about now, and how you eat as a social behavior, if you're lucky enough to have something to eat, of course. But the issue of dairy, you mentioned meat, and this is one problem we have today, that there is a too high consumption of dairy, to cut back on dairy. And that is also, as we know, a strategy to introduce it. And there's even an EU regulation on it to give school mix subsidy in order to promote the taste of it among children when the taste buds and preferences are being shaped. So that was a reflection. I didn't hear you address that at all. So I would just like to raise that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, let's get one more question here, and then we'll answer both of those.
Hi, I'm Anand Gopal from the Hewlett Foundation. Sorry, I have 2 questions, but I'll be really quick. One, there hasn't been a discussion today about the real-world opponents that strive to make the system, to keep the system as it is. One examples are, if you look in the United States, there's a bunch of states passing what are known as ag-gag laws that even prevent exposure of factory farming practices and things like that. So I was wondering who the opponents are and what strategies you will have to tackle that. A second question, which is probably related, is what is actually the most effective communication strategy around diets? What's the latest science on that? Because I know that if you sort of use naming and shaming approaches, that can have a backlash. So what is actually the best approach to have people move towards a more healthy plant-based diet?
Let's actually get one more question, and then we'll, right here in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Vicky Cango. I'm the Minister in charge of Water, Environment and Natural Resources, Nairobi County. Now, mine goes to what I think Katarina was discussing. 60% of our waste in Nairobi is organic waste. 60%. So that means more than 50% comes from food waste, meaning it goes back to the value chain of the supply of food and agricultural products. It means if we lack the appropriate technology for cold storage, preservation, and value addition for the time of lack, then we will continue to increase. Now, that 60% of organic waste goes to our landfill. We do not have a sanitary landfill, so it is just a dump site. And you can imagine the effect of organic waste dumped in a landfill, starting from issues of methane gas, a lot of toxicity from meat in the byproducts or the waste that comes from the decomposition of meat. And you can imagine the kind of complication that even it introduces to the technology, the appropriate technology for waste management. And I would really want to hear from Katarina. Other than us having an interruption in the value chain that we can have people access this food before it expires, how else then can we take care of this 50 or 60% before it lands in the dump site?
Great questions. And all right, we've got another hour. Is that right? Okay, the dairy question is a very important question and a very controversial question. So who wants to take on the dairy question? Yep.
I would just, I think it's a little bit of the same questions here because Denmark is very much agricultural land, a milk land, and we have a very strong lobby for that in Denmark. So I think that a lot of the issues, as I kind of spoke about in the beginning, is that the economic interest has very much have heavily inflict on what is health and has promoting certain kinds of food that is now labeled as healthy, but really is much more about an industry and much more about a lobby. So for me, it's like, and it's very good questions. And what is a healthy diet, and what is really what we need? But until now, it has very much been promoting by an industry much more than health. So we are now beginning to discuss much more about what is really healthy and not so much what is the industry wants to make money on. And I think that in Denmark, when we are working with a much more greener diet and a much less dairy or a meat-heavy diet, we are very much having the opposing lobby from the Danish agriculture and dairy production. That is, I guess, our hardest partners in this. So we have to get more aligned on the overall motivation on keeping us and the climate and the earth more healthy.
Mayor Welling.
Yeah, I agree very much with what Franciska said. And then I think we have to stop to talk about there's one diet that is the right diet, because it's different from people. When I have the responsibility for the elderly people, and they get malnutrition very easily, so they have to eat another diet than I have to eat as a normal grown-up person. Our kids have to eat another diet, and I think it's about finding the right balance between meat and diet, meat and dairy products in these different kind of people groups diet, and getting the knowledge to people of what is healthy and what is not healthy, because as Franciska said, we have a huge milk lobby in Denmark, or farming lobby in Denmark, and they're very resourceful, and we have to talk to them. But I also think that some of the problems you have, we also have as city as a whole, because cities have been put away from the farming industry, and some of the byproducts we have in the cities, like waste, or you can use in the farming industry to get better soil to to make the products in. So we have to reconnect with the rural areas again to make sure that we have a healthier way of producing food all over the world.
Yeah, dairy is one of those issues in the Eat Lancer report we talk about a lot, and I think we could spend a lot of time on this. So if anybody has any more questions, please afterwards, we'd be happy to raise this more. We've only got a couple more minutes, and I want to. So we've got 2 more minutes, okay? So real world opponents, or do you want to take on the food loss and waste?
No, I was
Okay.
thinking about the loss.
Okay, Katarina.
But
Okay.
do you want, yeah. Because I was thinking, because probably we have different challenges in different parts of the world. You say that there are about 60% that goes to food waste, and we have calculated that in Stockholm there are about 30% that goes. I mean, it's still too high a figure, but I think maybe because you mentioned that you have a lot of fresh food, you have like fresh food all the time. We are not used to having fresh food the whole year, so maybe we have other ways of preserving the food. And I usually, when I speak to my friends and they say, "Oh, I throw away some things after cooking," I said I always put it in the freezer. But you can also dry things, and you can put it in cans. And I mean, I think we come from a culture that we save food for the winter the whole year, and then we put it in cans, and maybe it's different, but I think we still have to start not like wanting those piles of food, because I think that gets us to buy more than we want, but it also gets the grocery stores to throw away more, because it sells more, but they also throw away more. So I think we have to change the view of what kind of food we buy. So I think there are so many different scopes in that, but maybe it's different, because I think if you can also find new methods of preserving the food also for us, I think that would be great.
We've only got 2 more minutes left, and unfortunately would somebody like to just very briefly comment on one of the questions I was asked? Real world opponents. There was I mean, this is a very important question in terms, and maybe nobody wants to answer it in the last minute.
I was just want to comment on the thing that Sisse also said about one of the things in the new food strategy that we just had in Copenhagen is also about reconnecting with the rural area, because we need to have the food security as well in Copenhagen, and we need not to have this huge import-export, but much more be self-serving in that sense. So in our land, which is a very farmed land, but it's only mostly for animal fodder, not for human. So we have to change the whole production, where we tend to produce food again for humans. So we in this food strategy, we also have a new relationship with the rural area around Copenhagen, and be Copenhagen as a city be a driver to change that food production in the whole Zealand or in Denmark, hopefully. So there is different kind of issues, but still it is around the same topics. And also on the waste, I think it's also much about how we present food. I mean, a lot of workplaces here in Copenhagen, we have buffets, and we have some kind of a culture that we need to have a lot to choose from, and there has to be a lot of everything, or else it's kind of poor, you know. And I think that mindset needs to change. We don't have to have a lot to choose from. We have to be more aware, and as you also said, not one diet is perfect, but the awareness of what is healthy is very important.
Yep.
We need to keep inspiring the people to just, you know, choose little but good.
And on that, speaking of inspiring, this has been an extremely inspiring panel. And I think that at the beginning we established the fact that the first step is we've got to make commitments, which we did. So I would like to thank C40 for the bold step that you took in saying let's get cities to sign up for this. And to take that risk, and that's extremely important. So we need that, and we also need cities and businesses to then therefore step up and say, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but we know we'll work through it together because we have to do that, and this is a global issue. And I want to thank the audience for being here at this session. I wish we had more time, but we don't. And you know, the great thing about food is it gives us agency. You know, a lot of us want to figure out what can I do to change and what can I do to make the world a better place. And food gives you that agency. It gives you that power 3 times every single day to actually change the food that you make or change the food that you eat. And that's a pretty powerful tool that each one of us has on our plate. So with that, I would like to thank the panelists, the speaker, C40 for hosting, and for the audience for being such a gracious audience. Thank you.